My son chose his wife over me. By the time the cruise ended, they regretted it. I paid for a 7-day Caribbean cruise for my son and his wife, and on the 4th night, they left me standing alone on the deck in the rain while they danced at a private party I wasn't invited to. What they didn't know was that the cruise line's owner was an old friend of my late husband's, and by the time we docked, my son would be begging me for a forgiveness I wasn't sure I had left to give. Before I tell you what happened on that ship, hit that like button and subscribe if you're the kind of person who believes family loyalty should never have an expiration date. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I love knowing who's sitting with me for this one. My name is Laura, I'm 71 years old, and this is the story of the cruise that changed everything. I should start by telling you who I was before all this happened, because the woman who boarded that ship is not the woman who got off it. I raised my son alone from the time he was 9 years old. His father died of a heart attack in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and I remember thinking in the middle of the worst day of my life, that I still had to make lunch for a 9-year-old boy who didn't understand yet that his world had ended. I worked 2 jobs for a while. Days at an insurance office, evenings doing alterations for a dry cleaner 3 blocks from our apartment. I sewed hems and let out waistbands until my fingers cramped, and I never once complained to my son about it, because I didn't want him to grow up thinking his existence was a burden. I wanted him to grow up feeling loved without condition. And he did grow up. He became a good student, then a good young man, then an engineer with a steady job, and eventually a wife. I liked her at first. I want to be honest about that because this isn't a story about a villain who was rotten from the start. When my son brought her home, she was polite. She complimented my cooking. She asked questions about my life like she was actually interested in the answers. I thought, good, he's found someone kind. I thought, good, I won't have to worry about him being alone. It was small things at first. She'd correct me at dinner about how I was coddling my son, even after he was 34 years old, as though a grown man needed to be defended against his own mother's love. She'd make comments about how some people don't know how to let their children grow up. She never used my name when she said these things. It was always some people, some mothers, some in-laws. But I always knew who she meant. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that new wives sometimes feel threatened by mothers-in-law, and that time would soften her, and that my son loved me enough that nothing she said would ever truly come between us. I was wrong about that last part, and it took me years to admit it. The distance grew slowly, the way water erodes a stone. You don't see it happening day to day. But one year you look back and the shape of everything has changed. Sunday dinners became once a month, then once a season. Phone calls got shorter. My son, who used to tell me everything, started talking to me the way you talk to a coworker you're friendly with but don't really know, surface pleasantries, weather, traffic, nothing real. Then, 2 years ago, I lost my sister. She was my last living sibling, the only person left who remembered our mother's voice the way I remembered it, who remembered the house we grew up in before it was torn down. When she died, I called my son and I could hear, even through the phone, that he wanted to be there for me, that some old part of him still wanted to comfort his mother. But I could also hear her in the background, telling him they had plans that weekend, telling him it wasn't practical to change their schedule for a funeral 3 states away. He didn't come. He sent flowers. He sent a very nice card with a very generic message, the kind you'd send to a distant colleague. And that was the day something in me went quiet and hard, like a door closing somewhere deep in my chest. I want you to understand something about me because it matters for what comes later. I am not a woman who screams. I am not a woman who makes scenes. I was raised by parents who believed dignity was the last thing you were allowed to lose, no matter what else life took from you. So when I felt that door close, I didn't cry in front of anyone. I didn't call my son and demand an apology. I simply began very quietly to plan. I've always believed that if someone shows you who they are, your job isn't to argue with them, it's to prepare. So when my son called me last spring and said, almost as an afterthought, that he and his wife were thinking about a cruise for their 10th anniversary but money was tight this year, I heard the request buried inside the complaint. I heard quite clearly that he wanted me to offer to pay. And here is where I made a decision that surprised even me. I said yes. I offered to book all 3 of us a cabin, well, 2 connecting cabins, because even at 71 I know better than to bunk with newlyweds on their anniversary trip, even a 10-year one. I told him I wanted to come along, that it would mean the world to me to celebrate with them, That after losing my sister I understood better than ever how precious time with family really is. He hesitated. I heard the hesitation clear as a bell down that phone line. But then he said yes because free is free, and because some small guilty part of him probably did want his mother there. What neither of them knew, what I hadn't told a single soul in the family, not even my son, was that the cruise line they'd chosen was founded by a man named Walter, an old business associate and close friend of my late husband. Walter and my husband had built up a small logistics company together back in the 70s, before my husband passed and Walter went on to found something much bigger. Walter and I had stayed in touch over the decades, mostly through Christmas cards and the occasional phone call, but the friendship was real. When I saw the name of the cruise line my son mentioned, I nearly dropped the phone. I hadn't sought this out. It simply landed in my lap, the way certain opportunities do when you've spent a lifetime being patient. I didn't say anything to Walter before we boarded. I didn't want special treatment out of spite. I just wanted, honestly, to enjoy a nice trip with my family, still holding out some small hope that things could be repaired between us. That hope did not last long. The first 2 days were pleasant enough on the surface. We had dinner together, we walked the deck, I took photos of the two of them by the railing with the ocean behind them, playing the doting mother because some part of me still wanted to believe I could earn my way back into the center of my son's life if I just tried hard enough. But by the third day, the pattern I'd feared began to show itself clearly. They started making plans without telling me. Excursions I only heard about after the fact, dinner reservations for two at the specialty restaurant while I ate alone at the buffet. On the fourth night, there was a private cocktail party held on the upper deck for a small group of guests who'd upgraded to a certain suite package. My son and his wife had that package. I did not because when I'd booked the trip, I'd chosen a comfortable but modest cabin for myself, not wanting to spend excessively even though I could have afforded better. I found out about the party because I saw them getting dressed up in the hallway outside their cabin, my daughter-in-law in a stunning silver dress, my son in a blazer I didn't recognize. "Where are you two headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. My daughter-in-law answered before my son could. "Oh, it's just a little thing for sweet guests. Adults only, very exclusive. You wouldn't really enjoy it anyway, it's a lot of standing around." I looked at my son, waiting for him to invite me anyway, to say something like, "Don't be silly, of course she can come, we'll figure it out." He didn't. He looked at his shoes. He mumbled something about how they wouldn't be out too late, and then they walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a countdown, and left me standing in the hallway of a ship in the middle of the ocean alone. It started raining not long after. I went up to the open deck anyway because I needed the air, because the walls of my cabin felt like they were closing in on me. I stood at the railing and let the rain soak through my cardigan, watching the dark water churn below, thinking about my sister, about my husband, about the sound of my son's voice as a 9-year-old boy asking me if Daddy was ever coming back. I thought about all the years I had given, quietly and without complaint, and how easily they had been set aside for a party with better lighting. I want to tell you that I cried because I did, but I also want to tell you that somewhere in that rain, standing alone on that deck, the sad, patient part of me finally stepped aside and let something steadier take over. I stopped grieving what I'd lost and I started thinking very clearly about what I still had. I had Walter's private cell number in my phone. I want to be careful here because I'm not going to pretend that what I did next was some grand, dramatic act of sabotage. Nothing so cheap as that. I didn't want to hurt anyone financially, or get anybody fired or embarrass my son publicly for its own sake. That's not who I am, and frankly, ruining someone rarely brings the peace people expect it to. What I wanted was something much simpler and, in its own way, much more effective. I wanted the truth to become visible. I wanted my son to see with his own eyes exactly who had been standing beside him all these years, and exactly who had been quietly working against her. The next morning I called Walter. We hadn't spoken in almost a year, but he answered on the second ring, delighted to hear my voice, and even more delighted to learn I was actually on one of his ships. I told him I'd love to see him if his schedule allowed, and as it turned out he happened to be aboard for a routine inspection that same week. Cruise line owners do that more often than people think, checking in on operations personally. He invited me to have dinner with him that evening at the captain's table, an invitation reserved for a very small handful of honored guests. I asked, almost shyly, if I might bring my son and his wife along. Of course, Walter said. Family is family. Bring them. I didn't tell my son who Walter was. I simply mentioned, over breakfast, that I'd run into an old friend of the family, and that we'd all been invited to a special dinner that evening. The captain's table, no less. I watched my daughter-in-law's expression shift immediately. The way people's faces change when status enters a room. Suddenly I was worth listening to. Suddenly there were questions. Who was this friend? How did I know him? Was it true guests weren't normally allowed at the captain's table unless personally invited? I answered vaguely, enjoying, I'll admit, the small taste of power that came from knowing something they didn't. That evening we dressed formally and made our way to the private dining room near the bridge. My son and his wife walked in expecting some minor acquaintance of mine, someone forgettable, someone they'd be polite to for 20 minutes before returning to their real vacation. Instead, they were greeted by the captain himself, and by Walter, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than their entire cruise package, who stood, took my hand warmly, and said in front of everyone at that table, Laura, it's been too long. Your husband would be so proud of the woman you've become. He always said you were the strongest person he knew. I watched my son's face change in real time. I watched him realize all at once that his mother, the woman he'd left standing alone in a hallway the night before, was not some burden to be managed or an inconvenience to be minimized. I watched my daughter-in-law's carefully composed expression falter as Walter turned to them and asked how they knew me, and my son, stammering slightly, said, She's my mother. Your mother, Walter repeated, smiling, raised the finest man I never got to hire. I tried for years to get her husband to bring their boy into the business. Laura, does he know that story? He didn't. There was so much I realized in that moment that my son didn't know. Not because I'd hidden it out of secrecy, but because he'd simply stopped asking. Stopped being curious about the woman who raised him. Somewhere along the way, I had become background noise in his life, a fact of his existence rather than a person with her own history, her own friendships, her own weight in the world. Over dinner, Walter told stories about my husband, about the early days of the business, about how I used to bring homemade bread to the office when they were working late nights trying to land their first big contract. He talked about how, after my husband died, several people in that world had quietly checked in on me over the years, made sure I was doing all right because that's what people who respected my husband did for his widow. My son sat there, mostly silent, absorbing a version of his mother he had never bothered to learn. My daughter-in-law tried, once or twice, to steer the conversation back toward herself, mentioning her own career, angling for Walter's attention, the way she always did at family gatherings when she felt the spotlight drifting somewhere she didn't control. But Walter, gracious as he was, kept circling back to me, to my husband, to the family history that existed long before she'd entered the picture. I don't think she was used to being politely, consistently outshined. I don't think she cared for it at all. By the end of that dinner, the whole tenor of the trip had shifted. Word travels fast on a ship, even a large one, and by the next morning, the staff who'd been merely courteous to me before were suddenly warm, attentive, almost deferential. My cabin got upgraded quietly without my asking. The concierge began greeting me by name. My son and his wife noticed, of course they noticed, and I watched something uncomfortable settle over both of them. The slow, dawning realization that they had spent days treating as an afterthought the one person on that ship who, it turned out, mattered. That night, my son came to my cabin alone. He knocked softly, the way he used to knock on my bedroom door as a boy when he'd had a nightmare. I let him in, and for a long moment he just stood there, not saying anything, looking older than I remembered him looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with the cruise. I'm sorry, he finally said. About the party. About a lot of things, honestly. I didn't realize how it must have looked. How it must have felt. I didn't make it easy for him, and I don't regret that. I told him the truth, calmly, the way I'd learned to tell hard truths over the years, without raising my voice, without theatrics, just plain and steady. I told him about the years of shrinking myself to avoid conflict with his wife. I told him about my sister's funeral, about the flowers that had arrived instead of him. I told him that love without presence isn't really love, it's just a feeling you have about someone from a comfortable distance, and that I hadn't raised him to love from a distance. He cried. My son, 36 years old, sat on the edge of my cabin bed and cried like the boy who'd lost his father in our kitchen all those years ago. And I let him because some things need to be felt all the way through before they can actually change anything. I won't pretend that one conversation fixed a decade of drift. It didn't. But it was a beginning, a real one, not the performative kind we've been doing for years at holiday dinners. In the months since that cruise, he's called more. He's visited without her sometimes, which I never asked for but also never discouraged, because a mother and son sometimes need room that doesn't include anyone else. She and I are civil now, careful, the way two people are when they've both decided that further conflict costs more than it's worth. I don't know if we'll ever be close. I've made my peace with that possibility. What I know for certain is this. I didn't need to scream or scheme, or burn anything down to be seen again. I only needed the truth to stand in the light for a moment, the way it did at that captain's table, surrounded by people who remembered who I was before I let myself become invisible in my own family. If you're a mother out there who has felt yourself fading into the background of your own children's lives, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not asking for too much when you ask to be seen. You are not a burden for wanting to matter to the people you sacrifice for. And sometimes the people who forgot your worth simply need one honest moment to remember it. Thank you for sitting with me through this story tonight. If it meant something to you, please give it a like, subscribe for more, and tell me down in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and I love knowing this old woman's stories are traveling further than she ever has. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and don't let anyone make you feel small in a life you built with your own two hands.